The first image that still wakes me up sometimes is nothing more than a low pine branch in a dim green light, holding a small cluster of metal that shouldn't be there. The needles around it are dusty and sun-bleached, but the keys themselves catch the light in a way the forest usually doesn't allow a dull flicker against all that bark and shadow. There's a plastic sleeve turning the color of old paper edges, curled, crinkling faintly whenever the wind moves through those trees. Inside that cloudy plastic is a photograph, 4 faces blurred by time, but still smiling in a way that doesn't belong in a place that quiet. You can almost hear how soft the air is there, how muffled the world feels under the weight of needles and damp soil. No cars, no voices, just distant birds and the slow creak of branches. If you reach out in your mind, you can feel the cold slickness of the laminate, the roughness of the bark under your fingers, the way the metal ring is cool even in the afternoon. Nobody is talking in that scene. Nobody is calling out. It's just those keys, swaying a little, holding on to a moment that should have stayed in the sunshine of a driveway hundreds of miles away. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I should probably start where the heat rises off the asphalt, not where the forest swallows sound. For me, all of this really begins in Phoenix, in a stucco neighborhood where the summer air feels like it's pressing against your chest the minute you open the front door. Back in August of 2001, I was 50-something in the making, but still a man in my mid-30s working 6 days a week at a small garage off Glendale Avenue, coming home with my hands smelling like oil and brake cleaner. The cicadas would be going full force by the time I pulled into my driveway, that dry electric buzz running through the evening, and somewhere down the street you'd hear a dog barking and the rattle of a screen door giving up one more time. The sunsets in that part of town can make even a strip mall look holy, wide bands of orange and purple laying themselves over block walls and sagging power lines, warm air carrying the faint odor of hot dust and lawn sprinklers. Most nights I'd stop by my little brother's place on the way home, partly because it was on my route, partly because their house felt like the center of something I didn't have on my own. Daniel and Laura lived in a single-story ranch with a tired mesquite tree out front that dropped tiny leaves all over his driveway. The gravel crunched under your tires when you pulled up, and if it was anywhere near dinner time, you could smell garlic and onions coming from the kitchen even before you killed the engine. Inside, the air was cooler, uneven from room to room, because their swamp cooler never quite figured out how to push the same amount of air down the hallway. You'd hear cartoons or a game show on low in the living room, pages turning where Grace curled up with a book, and somewhere nearby, Lily's small hands sorting rocks into special and extra special piles on the coffee table. Daniel was 40 back then, a civil engineer who spent most of his days staring at plans for overpasses and drain systems. But at home, he was just my kid brother, with his hair always a few weeks past when he should have gotten it cut. He liked things to work, liked systems, liked knowing where every tool was in his neat garage. The concrete floor swept cleaner than mine ever was. Laura, at 34, ran her classroom with the same quiet order she kept in their kitchen lists on the fridge sandwich bags lined up on the counter, the smell of coffee lingering in the air long after the pot had gone cold. She had this way of talking to the girls that made everything sound like an adventure without ever raising her voice, even when Lily tracked mud across the tile or Grace left library books open on the couch. Grace, at 11, moved through that house half in her own world. She always seemed to have a paperback in her hand, horses on the cover more often than not, and she'd read with one knee bouncing the faint sound of her foot tapping on the rug, while the ceiling fan hummed over her. When she looked up, her eyes were sharp and curious, already scanning for the next question to ask. Lily ate, and always barefoot, had pockets that clinked when she walked full of pebbles from school parking lots and playgrounds. If you sat on their couch for more than 5 minutes, she'd appear at your elbow with a rock in her palm, asking if you could feel how this one is smoother, like water, her small fingers pressing it into your hand until you did. That summer, the talk in their house circled around one thing: the big road trip north. There had been smaller trips before weekends down to Tucson, a couple of nights up near Flagstaff, where the pine trees smell like cold and the air feels thin and clean. But this was the first time they were going to take the girls all the way to Yellowstone. If I close my eyes, I can still see the map spread out on their dining table one Saturday afternoon, the plastic cover pushed aside, the paper creased where Laura had folded and refolded it. The late-day light came in slantwise through the blinds, laying stripes across the Arizona-Utah border, and the evaporative cooler rattled softly in the hallway, like it always did when the motor was getting tired. Daniel traced the route with a clean finger, his hands washed but still faintly scented with the sharp tang of solvent from the small repair he'd done that morning on their fence gate. Phoenix to Vegas, Vegas to Tremonton, Tremonton to the park. He said more to himself than to any of us, while Grace leaned in close enough that her hair brushed the map. Laura had highlighted their intended path in soft yellow, a faint glowing line cutting through Nevada and Utah all the way into Idaho and Wyoming. She'd circled campgrounds in blue ink, boxed in dates with neat handwriting, double-checking check-in times, the campground's name written in a teacher's clear script. Beside the map sat a folded brochure from the Park Service and a little stack of reservation printouts, the paper faintly warm from the copier at her school. In the driveway, the green minivan that had hauled those kids to soccer practice and school carnivals sat with its hood propped open. That vehicle was their workhorse, a '98 Caravan with a small dent in the rear bumper where some hurried shopper had backed into them at the grocery store the year before. On that same Saturday, after the sun started its slow drop and the worst of the heat eased off, Daniel and I worked over it like we were prepping a race car instead of a family van. The air smelled like hot rubber and motor oil, and the metal of the hood burned your fingers if you grabbed it too high. We changed the oil, checked the belts, and flushed the radiator until the water ran clear and cool out of the drain pan. Daniel Ever, the engineer, held the new coolant jug like it was a small piece of insurance, watching the green liquid glug down into the system, while I wiped my hands on a stained rag. He'd bought a handheld GPS a few weeks before, one of those chunky units you could clip to a belt with small gray buttons and a tiny screen that showed your coordinates, like the numbers meant something magical. He showed it to me in the fading light, the plastic warm from his hand, little beeps sounding as he scrolled through menus. "Back up," he said, nodding toward the open garage where the Atlas lay on the workbench next to an old coffee can full of screws. "We'll still use the maps, but this'll tell me where we are if we get turned around." The inside of that garage smelled like old wood and cold concrete with a hint of gasoline that never quite left the air. There were plastic tubs of camping gear stacked neatly along the wall, folding chairs, a tent that still carried the faint scent of pine needles from their last trip north, a cooler with a lid that popped when you opened it because of the temperature change. Lily's little backpack sat on top of one tub, its zipper half open, revealing a jumble of crayons and a small plastic horse. The weekend before they left, our parents and Laura's folks came over for a sort of early send-off cookout. The sky was still white-hot in the afternoon, but by the time Henry and Maria arrived with a tray of homemade tortillas wrapped in a kitchen towel, the edge had come off the heat. The smell of charcoal drifted across the small backyard, mixing with the sweet scent of Maria's grilled onions and peppers. My mother fussed with paper plates on the patio table, while my father adjusted the old radio, trying to get a clear AM station under the static. Henry, at 80, moved slower than he liked, but he still insisted on bringing his own bag of charcoal and the lighter fluid, shaking the briquettes into the metal grill with a rattle that reminded me of thunderstorms on a tin roof. Maria, her hair pinned back, laughed quietly every time Lily ran past and brushed against her, leaving little dusty streaks on her skirt. The girls' voices overlapped with the soft metallic clink of the wind chimes by the sliding glass door, the kind of small domestic music you don't think twice about until it's gone. At one point in the evening, Maria pulled a disposable camera from her purse, the kind with a little plastic wheel you had to thumb forward, and started lining everyone up in front of the van. The light was low and orange, the sun just kissing the tops of the block walls, and the air felt thick but bearable after a long day. Daniel and Laura stood side by side, shoulders touching, while Grace and Lily leaned against the front fender, their sandals dusty from running on the gravel. The flash popped, leaving that brief, ghostly after-image floating in your vision, and the smell of grilled meat and hot concrete seemed to deepen around us. I remember thinking as I leaned back against the warm hood after the pictures were done, that they looked like one of those photographs you find in a frame at the store before you put your own family in. The girl's hair was a little messy. Daniel's shirt was smudged with grease from the earlier work on the van, and Laura had a small flour mark on her shoulder from making tortillas with Maria, but they were smiling in that easy, unconscious way people do when they're standing on the edge of something good. The radio murmured in the background, the announcer's voice thin and distant, and somewhere in the neighborhood, a firework left over from the 4th cracked faintly in the sky. On the morning they actually left August 11th, the desert sky was still pale and washed out, the heat not yet fully settled in. I drove over early, the tires humming on the still cool pavement windows down because the air felt almost gentle at that hour. Inside the house, the coffee maker gurgled, sending that dark, bitter smell through the kitchen, while Laura moved from counter to counter checking and rechecking lists she'd written on yellow sticky notes. Pancakes hissed softly on the griddle, the sound of batter meeting hot metal, and there was syrup on the edge of Lily's chin as she bounced in her chair. Suitcases waited by the front door, tagged with little strips of tape Laura had written their names on. The van's sliding door was open, letting in a wash of morning light, and you could smell the faint plastic scent of new toys the girls had tucked into their seatback pockets. Daniel stood in the driveway with that GPS in one hand and his old Nokia phone in the other, comparing the hotel address written on a scrap of paper to the route he'd already traced on the map. There was a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, not from stress, so much as the rising temperature and the blacktop radiating warmth under his sneakers. We loaded the last cooler into the back together, the chest cold enough that a little fog curled up when he opened it to show off the neatly stacked sandwiches and sodas. Grace slid into the second row with a book already open, the seatbelt clicking across her lap with a dull snap, and Lily climbed into the back, the fabric of the seat rasping under her as she shifted around searching for the best view out the window. Henry and Maria arrived just in time to stand on the sidewalk and wave Maria, holding that same disposable camera, the plastic casing warm from her hand even before she raised it. I hugged each of them at the driver's side door, the smell of sunscreen and laundry soap and coffee clinging to their shirts. When I stepped back, Daniel grinned at me through the open window, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the gear shift, the dash of the van already warm to the touch. "We'll call from the campground," he said, his voice steady and casual over the low hum of the idling engine. "Probably Monday afternoon. If not, it just means we're out of range." I watched them back out, the crunch of tires over the gravel sounding louder than usual in the morning quiet. The van paused at the end of the street, blinker clicking softly, an orange pulse reflected in the side mirror, then turned toward the main road and disappeared behind the palms and telephone poles. The sun had climbed a little higher by then, and the light had that washed-out quality it gets before the real intensity of midday kicks in. That night, after a long day at the shop, I sat in my small living room with the windows cracked just enough to let in the smell of hot dust and a faint trace of creosote from someone's swamp cooler. The ceiling fan whirred above me, a soft, steady whoosh, and the digital clock on my cable box glowed green in the dim room. Their call wasn't due yet, not really. They were still somewhere between here and the mountains, I told myself. But I remember glancing at the silent phone on the end table, its smooth plastic cool under my fingertips when I reached over to move it closer. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, and my porch light cast a small circle on the concrete, shining longer than it usually did before I finally got up to turn it off. I remember the moment the quiet began to feel wrong. It was a Sunday night in Phoenix, August, thick in the air, the kind of heat that settles into the stucco and stays long after the sun has gone down. I'd left the windows cracked just enough to catch whatever breeze might wander through, and the living room smelled faintly of warm dust and the old leather of my recliner. Their call should have come by late afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just a casual check-in from the road, Laura's voice bright and tired, the girls chiming in from the back seat. That was the plan. But the hours slid by and the house around me stayed still. The only sound, the gentle push of the ceiling fan cutting slow circles above my head. The phone sat on the side table like a loyal dog waiting for a command, its gray plastic cool when I touched it, checking for missed calls I already knew weren't there. I told myself the same thing I always did when someone was running behind, they're out of range, or the girls are restless, or they stopped at some overlook and lost track of time. Still, something in the air felt off, like the way the neighborhood gets quiet before a monsoon rolls in. I remember calling the motel in Tremonton first just to hear the desk clerk tell me they'd checked out that morning right on schedule. His voice was thin through the line, the static making it sound like he was speaking from somewhere farther away than Utah. That should have eased me, but it didn't. Next, I tried Henry and Maria. They were sitting in their kitchen, a slow-ticking clock on the wall behind them, waiting for the same call I was. I could hear the tightness in Maria's voice before she even said hello. She'd been standing by her phone for hours, the cord stretched across the counter like a lifeline. Henry said he'd tried Daniel's cell phone twice, each time getting that hollow sound before voicemail kicked in. Maybe the highway they'd taken turned out to be one of those dead spots that stretch on forever. It happens in the Westland so open it swallows a signal whole. We told each other not to worry. People run late on vacations. The girls might have wanted one more stop for photos. Maybe there'd been construction. Or maybe they just forgot what time they promised to call. I kept repeating that line as if saying it often enough could make it true. But a strange chill settled low in my chest, cutting right through the August heat, and no amount of rational talk could loosen it. I found myself walking from room to room like I was looking for something I'd misplaced. The carpet warm under my bare feet, the house too quiet except for the faint drone of a distant plane passing overhead. By 10 o'clock the desert night had settled deep outside. Crickets were chirping in a steady, scratchy pulse through the open windows. The porch light cast a small, bright circle across my walkway, insects tapping softly against the glass. I dialed Daniel's number again, then Laura's classroom voicemail out of pure desperation, even though I knew she wouldn't check it until school started again. Nothing changed. The same silence. The same recorded voice. I told myself I'd wait until morning. But sleep wouldn't come. Every hour I checked the phone again. Every hour, nothing. I stepped outside just after 1 in the morning, the pavement still radiating heat through the soles of my shoes, the sky wide and star-filled. In that way desert skies are when the world seems too open for comfort. The air tasted dry metallic, almost like the first breath before a storm. And in that quiet street, with all the houses dark, no cars passing, no late walkers heading home, I felt a strange hollowness I couldn't explain. When I finally fell asleep, it was closer to dawn. The sunlight that woke me was pale and tired-looking, leaking through the blinds like watered-down paint. I reached for my phone before I even sat up. Still nothing. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like missing a step on a staircase. I called Daniel again, straight to voicemail. I listened to his recorded greeting, his easy voice sounding so normal, so everyday, so unaware of what was happening, unaware of how many times I'd hear those same seconds on repeat over the next few hours. By mid-morning, Maria had called me back twice. She'd tried the campground directly, her voice trembling when she replayed the conversation. The ranger at the desk told her their reservation had stood untouched the night before. No one had shown up. No one had called ahead. No one had checked in. The words made my scalp prickle like the air pressure had shifted in the room. I found myself pacing in tight circles across my kitchen tile, the cool floor grounding me even as my mind spun. "We'll give it more time," I told her, though my mouth had gone dry. They might be stuck behind traffic. Maybe the girls needed to stop again. Maybe the park entrance was crowded. But Maria was already crying quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. I could hear Henry in the background asking her to sit down, his old chair creaking across the floor. Something in their house must have felt wrong too, the same way mine did, the same low hum of dread moving through the walls. I called the highway patrol in Idaho next, my hand shaking just enough to make me grip the phone tighter. The dispatcher was polite calm, the kind of voice trained to steady people like me. She asked a few questions, make and model of the van, the ages of the girls, the last contact any of us had. I could hear typing on the other end, and the faint murmur of radios behind her. She didn't say anything alarming, but there was something in the pause between her words, something too measured to be casual. She told me she'd pass the information along. She told me they'd keep an eye out. It still didn't feel real. It felt like a mistake that would resolve itself with a single call. I kept expecting my phone to light up with their number, to see Daniel's name on the screen, and hear him laugh in that sheepish way of his, and tell me they were fine, that the girls were cranky, that the signal up here was terrible, and they'd forgotten to stop somewhere with a landline. But the phone stayed dark and stubborn in my hand, its surface collecting a thin sheen of sweat from my palm. As the afternoon crept on, the heat rose like it always does in Phoenix, slow at first, then suddenly oppressive, pressing down through the window glass. I turned down the blinds to keep the glare out, but it didn't help. Every sound outside seemed louder. A truck rumbling down the street, a neighbor's dog barking in short, agitated bursts, a garbage bin lid slamming closed. My nerves were so raw that each noise felt like someone flicked a finger against my spine. I sat on the couch with the phone on my knee, scrolling through the few photos I had of them on the small square screen. The images were pixelated, the colors washed out, but seeing their faces, Grace with her crooked smile, Lily with her favorite rock held up for the camera, Laura brushing hair from her forehead, Daniel squinting against the sun, hit me harder than I expected. The weight in my chest tightened until I had to take slow breaths to steady it. The house smelled faintly of last night's coffee grounds and warm upholstery, familiar scents that suddenly felt misplaced in a moment filled with so much unknown. Just after 4, Maria called again. She'd tried the campground once more, still nothing. She'd also spoken to the ranger who'd be on duty that evening. He told her politely that families arrive late sometimes. People take detours. People underestimate drive times. There were a dozen simple explanations, but even through the receiver I could tell Maria didn't believe him. Her voice came out hollow, distant, like she was speaking from down a long hallway. Around dinner time, I drove to my parents' place without even thinking about it. The tires hummed along the hot pavement, and the air that came through the cracked window tasted dry, tinged with the smell of sun-baked desert plants. My mother opened the door before I knocked her face tight, her eyes already swollen. My father sat in his recliner, the TV muted but glowing with the late afternoon news. Nobody had anything new to say. We just moved around the house like people bracing for an earthquake, touching objects without seeing them, staring out windows as though the street might give us an answer. When the sun finally slipped toward the horizon, the sky turned that strange, deep orange that feels both beautiful and foreboding. The shadows in the living room stretched long and thin, creeping across the tile. My mother stood at the sink, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the counter, a nervous habit she only falls into when she's scared. My father kept clearing his throat like he was about to speak but didn't know what words to use. Just before nightfall, as I stood in the doorway watching the street grow darker, a set of headlights rolled slowly into view. The engine idled low, the kind of steady rumble you feel more than hear. The vehicle came to a stop in front of the house, the beams cutting across the gravel and casting long, sharp shadows across our yard. When the door opened and a uniformed man stepped out, He paused for a moment, adjusting his hat in the fading light as if trying to gather the right words. The air felt suddenly cooler, the desert breeze brushing against my arms, carrying with it the unmistakable sense that, whatever this man had come to say, our world was about to tilt in a direction we couldn't yet see. When the deputy stepped through my parents' doorway that evening, the cool air from outside followed him in, brushing past my arms like a warning. His radio crackled at his hip, soft bursts of static that sounded oddly out of place in that quiet living room. He spoke gently, choosing each word with the kind of care people use when they know a family is holding on by threads. By the time he finished, the world I'd been trying to keep steady tilted. They'd located the van, he said. It was abandoned on a remote Forest Service road in Idaho, locked everything inside intact. No signs of foul play, but no sign of my brother or his family either. The deputy kept his hat in his hands the whole time, his thumbs rubbing at the brim. Outside, the streetlights hummed faintly, and the sky had that deep violet color that comes right before night takes over. That was the moment I felt the shift. The heavy realization that whatever this was, it had moved beyond late calls or spotty cell service. It had turned into something official, something urgent, something we couldn't handle alone. By dawn the next morning, I was on a flight heading north. The cabin air smelled like warm plastic and recycled coffee, and my fingers drummed quietly on the armrest through most of it. When I landed, rangers and deputies were already gathering at a gravel pullout near the forest road where the van sat waiting. Their vehicles lined the shoulder-white trucks with green stripes, county cruisers with dust on the tires, volunteers' pickups with faded bumper stickers. The sun was low, the light pale and gold, and you could see everyone's breath in the cool morning air. A ranger unfolded a map across the hood of his truck, the paper snapping softly in the breeze. Someone handed me a cup of coffee in a paper cup. It tasted burnt, but the heat steadied me. The van looked strangely small in that wilderness, like a toy left behind by mistake. Its green paint was dulled by dust, the windows reflecting only sky and pine. When the rangers opened it in front of me, the inside smelled faintly of granola bars and sun-warmed fabric, the smell of family trips, of little things that should have led them home. The girls' backpacks were still there, their jackets folded neatly, Laura's notes tucked between the seats. There wasn't chaos or struggle or anything that pointed to someone else, just absence. A hollow, echoing absence. The search crews moved fast once the initial assessment was made. They worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that only comes from training and grim experience. A ranger with a clipboard read off names, assigning teams to sections of the forest as radios crackled to life. Dogs barked excitedly as their handlers suited them up, the jingling of their tags sharp against the thick morning air. Volunteers tightened the straps on their day packs, adjusted water bottles, tested their compasses. A helicopter waited nearby, its rotors ticking in the wind, ready to lift once the morning haze cleared enough for visibility. When they started out, the sound of boots on gravel filled the air, steady, rhythmic, purposeful. I followed one of the groups headed toward the western slope. The trail was narrow, the ground soft from morning dew, and the air carried the cool bite of altitude. Pine needles cushioned each step, and every once in a while a twig snapped beneath someone's heel. The forest made its own kind of silence, the kind that presses in on you, thick and watchful. We called their names every few minutes, voices echoing off the ridges and fading just as quickly. Nothing answered back, but the wind moving through the branches. Searchers checked small clearings where pine sap scented the air, scanned ravines, where shadows pooled thick as ink, and peered into narrow game trails that disappeared behind clusters of brush. Each time someone radioed in a possible sighting, a bit of fabric, a faint footprint, the tension rose for a moment before dissolving again into disappointment. One scrap of blue cloth snagged on a low branch turned out to be from an old tarp left behind years earlier. A partial print near a creek belonged to a hunter who'd passed through months before. Even the dogs, usually so confident, seemed to lose their sense of direction whenever the wind shifted unexpectedly, noses lifting, then dropping again as if the forest were playing tricks on them. The hours stretched long. Sunlight sifted through the trees in thin, dusty beams, catching on insects drifting lazily in the heat. Radios hissed with updates. Section 4 clear, no sign at the ridge. Checking the drainage to the east. Each report felt heavier than the last. I found myself studying every broken twig, every patch of disturbed earth, even though I knew the teams were better trained than I was. The truth is, when someone you love is missing, your eyes search for them everywhere, even in places you know they'll never be. Later in the afternoon, the helicopter lifted off, sending a rush of warm air over the clearing as it rose. The sound was deep and mechanical, vibrating in my chest as the blades cut through the sky. From above, they said you could sometimes spot the smallest things, fabric movement, even glints of metal. I watched it disappear over the ridge, its distant thrum fading into the open sky. When it returned nearly an hour later, the pilot shook his head before the skids even touched the ground. Dense canopy, he said. Too many shadows. Nothing stood out. As the searches continued, theories began to settle in around the edges like fog. Some volunteers speculated that Daniel had tried walking toward a nearby highway, misjudging the distance. Others wondered if they'd taken a wrong turn into a part of the forest not marked on their map. A pair of older men locals from a nearby town murmured about the geothermal vents scattered in that region, how steam could rise in strange places and confuse even seasoned hikers. One of them mentioned seeing weather roll in fast at altitude, how thin mountain air could disorient you quicker than you'd think. None of these explanations brought comfort. They just hung in the air, forming a cloud of maybes that shifted every time a new search area turned up empty. At one point, a volunteer came back with wide eyes, saying he heard something out in the brush, some kind of faint calling. But when teams rushed over, all they found was the distant echo of wind sweeping up the slope, fooling the ear the way loneliness can fool the mind. By the third day, fatigue set in everywhere. The rangers moved slower, but remained focused, their faces smudged with dust. Coffee thermoses were passed around, the metallic click of their lids punctuating quiet conversations. Some volunteers rubbed their shoulders or stretched their backs between assignments, their boots coated in gray dirt up to the laces. The air grew warmer each afternoon, carrying the scent of dry pine and sun-baked soil, and the search areas grew wider, stretching into terrain even the locals rarely visited. There were moments when hope surged, brief, sharp, almost painful. A dog barked insistently near a cluster of boulders, nose to the ground, tail rigid. Everyone rushed over, hearts hammering. But whatever scent it picked up drifted away on the next breeze, leaving us staring at empty earth. A ranger spotted a distant flash of white through the trees, and for a heartbeat we held our breath. It turned out to be part of an old, discarded cooler cracked open by weather and time. Through it all, I felt a strange pull between wanting to believe they'd simply lost their way and fearing something far more final. Each open patch of ground, each quiet trail, each stillness stretched my nerves thin. The forest seemed endless, a living maze of trunks and shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it held answers it wasn't ready to give up. The sun dipped lower each day, casting long, thin beams across the clearings, and by evening the chill returned to the air, catching in my throat with every breath. On the fourth morning, when I arrived at the staging area, I noticed the tone had changed. People spoke in lower voices. Maps were being remarked. A deputy from the county leaned into the ranger's truck, studying one section of the map more intently than before. There was no triumph in their faces, just concentration, the kind that comes when small details start forming patterns, even loose ones. I stood by the tailgate of a pickup, listening to the static on the radio fade in and out like distant whispering. A light breeze stirred the dust around my boots, carrying the scent of pine resin and something faintly sulfurous from deeper in the forest. I didn't think much of it at first. The ground here had always held strange pockets of mineral smell. but something about the way the rangers exchanged glances told me they were reevaluating the area, looking not just outward from the van, but toward places the family might have gone intentionally, trying to solve their own problem before anyone ever knew they needed help. Then, just as I reached for the thermos someone had set near the truck bed, a ranger approached from the far side of the clearing. His steps were deliberate, his eyes fixed on the supervising deputy. He carried something under his arm, a clipboard or maybe a folded piece of equipment I couldn't quite tell from the distance. But it was the way he held it close and careful that made the hairs at the back of my neck rise. The deputy straightened, lowering his hat to block the sun as the ranger reached him. They spoke in low tones, their silhouettes framed against the tall pines, and even from where I stood I could feel the shift in the air. It wasn't discovery. Not yet. But it was the first undeniable sign that the forest had given them something, some direction, some hint, some quiet nudge toward the truth that had been hiding in those trees all along. The ranger who had crossed the clearing that morning spoke quietly to the supervising deputy, their heads bent over whatever he carried. I couldn't hear the words, only the low rumble of their voices, but something in the stillness around them pulled at me. Even the volunteers nearby seemed to sense it. Conversations tapered off, boots slowed on the gravel, and the wind through the pines shifted just enough to let the silence settle in. The deputy lifted his chin toward the northeast ridge, scanning the tree line with a look that made my stomach tighten. Then his radio crackled a sharp burst, cutting through the quiet, and he answered with a briskness I hadn't heard from him before. Whatever they'd found, it was enough to change the tone of the search. We moved toward the ridge in a loose, steady line. The ground climbed gradually, the soil turning from soft brown earth to a paler, rockier mix that crunched beneath our steps. I could smell the sharper tang of minerals in the air, carried by a faint breeze that came from deeper in the forest. As we approached a cluster of boulders, I saw more rangers gathered there, their uniforms a patch of muted green against the stone. They stood in a half circle, facing something just out of view. No one looked back at us. They were fixed on whatever had demanded their attention. I stopped a few feet behind them, trying to find my breath. One of the search dogs whined softly, pulling at its leash tail stiff. The handler knelt beside it, whispering something I couldn't hear, his hand resting gently on the dog's shoulder. A thin ribbon of steam rose from beyond the rocks, drifting upward in a wavering line. The air around it smelled faintly of sulfur, a subtle but unmistakable sting in the nostrils. A ranger stepped aside, and that's when I saw it, a narrow footpath barely visible tapering between two large stones. The ground around it looked disturbed, the kind of unevenness that doesn't happen on its own. The rangers had placed small orange flags along the perimeter, their bright color oddly cheerful against the muted forest floor. At the entrance to the path lay a scattering of objects, twigs broken at sharp angles, patches of moss pulled away from the earth, and one smooth stone that seemed deliberately out of place, as if someone had once rested there even briefly. "Found something up ahead," one of the deputies said under his breath, not turning to see who was behind him. "Keep it tight. Slow steps." His voice carried the weight of someone trying to stay steady while preparing for the worst. We followed the narrow path downhill into a shallow pocket of land where the trees grew closer together, their branches knitting overhead. The light dimmed, turning the air cool and gray. Pine needles cushioned the ground in a thick carpet that muffled our footfalls, making every breath sound louder. The slope funneled us into a small clearing barely the size of a living room where the earth dipped into a natural bowl. At the edge of that bowl was a low boulder with a hollow space beneath it, dark, sheltered, partially hidden by roots and soil. Two rangers crouched by the boulder, their gloved hands moving carefully around the opening. One of them lifted something fabric frayed and sun-faded. It looked like part of a sleeve, the stitching worn, but still distinguishable under the dust. The color hit me first. It was a muted pink, the kind of pink Laura might have chosen for Lily on a chilly morning. My legs went weak, and for a moment I thought my knees might give out. A faint ringing settled in my ears, drowning out the rustle of trees overhead. The ranger didn't lift the fabric quickly. He handled it the way you'd handle something fragile, brushing away the top layer of earth with deliberate motions. Another ranger held a small evidence bag open, the plastic crinkling softly. I watched as the cloth was placed inside, the zipper sealed with a slow, decisive pull. There was something else in the hollow, a small scrap of sole rubber worn cracked from time. When the ranger picked it up, a thin trail of dirt fell from it, settling in the dry air before disappearing into the pine needles. The curve of it, just the curve, was enough to bring back a memory I hadn't expected to hit so hard. Lily's feet kicking against the back of my car seat on the 4th of July, her shoes tapping a restless rhythm as she listed every firework she hoped to see. One of the deputies placed a hand gently on my shoulder, grounding me. His skin was cool against the back of my neck where my shirt had loosened. "We don't know everything yet," he said quietly. "But we think this was a shelter. Maybe where they stayed that first night." His voice had softened the edges, worn down by years of delivering difficult words. A few feet away, another team moved toward a narrow ravine that dropped into shadow. The wind carried the faint scent of wet stone from below, even though no water ran through it now. One ranger knelt near the edge and pointed to something among the rocks, small pails scattered across a patch of dark soil. I couldn't make out the shapes clearly, but a stillness swept over the group as they realized what they were seeing. They called for the forensic team with a tone that carried both sorrow and resignation. The world around me felt like it had slowed the air thick, each movement heavier. My chest tightened, and I focused on the simple act of drawing breath in and out. The trees, tall and indifferent, watched over us without bending. The light filtering through the branches fell in thin stripes across the ground, illuminating bits of moss, a single pine cone, the edge of a torn leaf. Details small enough to miss on any other day, but sharp and almost cruel in their clarity now. As the forensic team approached, carrying darker-colored cases and carefully marked bags, the rangers widened the boundary around the area. Yellow tape unfurled with a faint whisper, creating a rough circle around the clearing. Cameras clicked softly. A notebook flipped open. Gloves snapped into place. Everything deliberate, everything measured. The weight of professionalism filling the spaces where hope had once lived. The deputy led me back up the slope toward the staging area, each step feeling both too slow and too fast. The air grew warmer as we climbed, losing that strange chill of the sheltered bowl. I could hear radio traffic more clearly now, updates about coordinates requests for additional personnel instructions to notify supervisors. Every voice was calm, but beneath that calm sat a heaviness I recognized too well. One ranger met us halfway up the trail. He looked to be in his early 30s, sandy hair pushed back under his cap. His eyes flicked briefly to mine, then back to the deputy. "There's more," he said. "About a mile northeast. Something metallic hanging from a branch. Looks old." The words settled in the space between us like settling dust. The deputy nodded, thanked him, then asked him to show the way. My breath caught in my throat. Not from shock this time, but from an instinctive understanding that whatever they had found there might speak to the last conscious choice my brother ever made. We walked for nearly 30 minutes, the terrain leveling out into a broad slope covered in tall grasses and scattered stones. The wind shifted again, lighter here, carrying the scent of sun-warmed cedar. And then, in the middle of all that green and gold, hanging from a low pine branch like a quiet signal, was a metal keyring. The chain had darkened with age, its edges dulled from years of weather. Attached to it was a small laminated photograph, the colors washed out, the faces blurred, but still unmistakable. There was also a plastic pouch, yellowed the seal, brittle-looking but intact. A ranger eased it open, the plastic crackling. Inside was a note, the ink faintly bled, but the handwriting still legible. The words were steady, the lines straight, despite whatever fear must have been present when it was written. A message left behind. A trail marker. A plea for help. I stared at that tree, at that note, at the little photo, trying so hard to hold on to its color, and everything inside me hollowed out. There wasn't shock anymore. Shock had come earlier in small doses, but this was different. This was the understanding settling in heavy and unmovable. That moment, the one I had feared for weeks, months, years, without ever quite facing, had arrived. And it came without cruelty, without violence, without any of the monstrous possibilities we'd whispered about. It came wrapped in the simple, devastating truth that they had tried to save themselves. They had tried to find their way home. After the note was collected, after the photos were taken and the coordinates recorded, the deputy guided me back toward the vehicles. The sun had begun to sink behind the ridge, laying long shadows across the ground. The air cooled again, brushing my skin like a reminder that night would fall soon, and this place, this forest with all its secrets, would grow quiet once more. At the staging area, an officer stood near his cruiser. The door opened, the interior lights casting a dim glow on the gravel. A portable generator hummed softly nearby, powering a few work lamps already being set up for the night. Across the hood of a truck, someone spread out a new map marking fresh boundaries with a thick black pen. As I reached the edge of the clearing, the sheriff himself approached, his expression lined with a kind of sorrow that comes from too many cases like this. He didn't need to say much. The look in his eyes was enough to tell me that the next hours would be long filled with forms and questions and statements, procedures meant to lay out the facts even when the heart wants none of it. I took a slow breath, the scent of dust and pine settling deep in my lungs, and stepped into the circle of light from the work lamps. Night was coming, and with it the beginning of everything we would have to face. The hours after the discovery moved in a kind of muted haze, as if the world had slipped into half speed without telling any of us. Deputies spoke in low tones, their radios murmuring back and forth with coded updates. The light rigs clicked on one by one as the sun dropped behind the ridge, throwing long, thin beams across the clearing. I remember the faint hum of the generator, steady and unbothered, filling the spaces where none of us could find words. When the sheriff asked if I could step into his truck to make a few calls, no one ever wants to make the vinyl seat felt too cold against my back, the cab smelling faintly of dust and old coffee. My hands shook so badly I had to brace the phone against the steering wheel just to dial. Maria answered on the first ring. She didn't say hello, just my name, soft and trembling like she already knew something had changed in the air. I kept my voice steady, or tried to, but by the time I got the words out, her sobs filled the line, raw and distant, like they were echoing through a long hallway. Henry took the phone next. His breathing sounded labored, shallow. He thanked me for being there, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us said more than anything either of us could offer. My parents didn't cry right away. My father sat down hard at the kitchen table when I told him, the chair legs screeching across the tile. My mother kept one hand pressed to her chest, her lips trembling as she tried to picture what I was describing. They asked about the note, about where it was found, about whether the searchers were certain. I answered as best I could, but each explanation felt heavier than the last. There was no making sense of any of it, only absorbing it 1 inch at a time. Over the next few days, the search area shifted into a recovery zone. The forest fell quiet again, save for the methodical movement of investigators and the occasional hum of the helicopter circling overhead. Evidence markers appeared like tiny declarations of grief, bright colors against muted soil. The air carried that unmistakable scent of pine warmed by the sun, mixed with the faint sulfur drifting from geothermal vents deeper in the woods. A strange combination, both sharp and earthy, that lodged itself in my senses. They handled everything with the kind of respect you can't teach careful hands. Clear instructions, a gentleness that comes from knowing families will live inside these moments for the rest of their lives. Samples were taken, coordinates, logged photos captured from every angle. A forensic tech placed the key ring into a sealed pouch with a softness that felt almost reverent. When I saw the laminated picture inside it, faces blurred but still undeniably theirs, it was like taking a blow square to the chest. I had to step away for a minute, breathe in the cooler air near the tree line, and steady myself on a trunk slick with resin. No arrests were made. There was no suspect, no lurking threat, no sign anyone had ever meant harm. The truth that surfaced in those woods was far simpler and far more heartbreaking. They had followed what looked like smoke, hoping for help. They had misread the land, been confused by steam rising in the distance, moved through terrain that twisted back on itself. They'd done everything people do when they're trying to survive. Every choice they made was reasonable, logical, human. The wilderness just didn't offer them the one thing they needed most a way back. When the case shifted back to Phoenix, it became an open but settled file. Not closed in the emotional sense, those files never close, but understood. Explained. Assigned to nature's indifference rather than someone's cruelty. The DNA analysis took time. The labs worked carefully, comparing tiny fragments with samples kept from the Alvarez home years earlier. When the confirmation finally arrived, the sheriff called me personally. His voice was low, respectful, carrying the weight of a man who knows there's no good way to hear such news, even when you've been expecting it. The memorial service took place on a warm October day, the kind where the sun casts soft gold over everything, and even the air feels gentle, as if it knows it shouldn't intrude. A small crowd gathered in the church courtyard, teachers from Laura's school, neighbors from their street, a few co-workers from Daniel's engineering firm. People spoke quietly, hugging one another with a slow, tired tenderness. Someone placed a framed family photo near the front, one taken in their backyard years earlier, the mesquite tree behind them in full leaf. Seeing that picture frozen in time, untouched by fear or confusion, made my throat tighten. For a long while afterward, I drifted through my days as if walking underwater. The shop where I worked felt strangely hollow, even with the clang of tools and the smell of grease thick in the air. I'd find myself staring at the passenger seat of a car I was repairing, imagining Grace with her nose in a book, or Lily swinging her legs absent-mindedly. Even grocery aisles caught me off guard. Rows of lunchbox snacks, children's jackets in bright colors, small things that used to be ordinary, but now carried the weight of memory. My parents grew quieter. My father took to sitting outside in the early mornings, listening to the steady hum of distant traffic. My mother kept the last drawing Lily had given her, a little sketch of a horse with a crooked smile tucked into the frame of the kitchen mirror. As the years passed, their grief softened at the edges the way a stone does in a river. It never disappeared, but it became smoother, more bearable to touch. Henry and Maria moved to a smaller home close to their church, one with a shaded porch where Maria could sit in the evenings and pray. She kept a candle in the living room that she lit on certain anniversaries the day they left. The day the news came, the day the confirmation arrived. The flame always flickered gently, sending a warm glow across the photographs on the shelf. People often assume that after the investigation winds down, life somehow resets. But the truth is quieter and heavier. You carry the forest with you, the cool air beneath the boulders, the smell of pine resin, the sight of that key ring swaying softly on a branch. You carry the understanding that sometimes the world doesn't break because of malice, but because of small decisions made under a sky that looks harmless. Over time, I found myself returning to simple routines, early mornings at the shop, long drives through the desert where the horizon stretches endlessly, evenings spent listening to old records with the windows open. Those routines didn't erase anything, but they steadied me. Life continued in small, deliberate steps, the way you walk after an injury, carefully aware of the places that still hurt. 2 decades passed before the forest offered its final gift, a photographer stumbling upon that key ring after 23 summers and 23 winters. When the pictures reached me, the colors muted by sun and time, I sat at my kitchen table for a long while, tracing the faded lines of their faces with my eyes. There was no anger in me by then, only a deep, steady sadness and a kind of reverence for the courage they showed in their final hours. They didn't give up. They kept moving, kept trying, kept hoping. That matters. It always will. What stays with me most is the image of that branch. The way the keys hung there, patient and persistent, holding on through storms and seasons until someone finally noticed. It's a reminder that the world remembers in its own way, even when we think it has gone silent. And in the quiet moments when the sun sets low and the air cools just enough to feel like a distant forest evening, I can still see that branch swaying gently, telling the story that outlived them. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.